5 days before I was supposed to sign the papers giving my daughter power of attorney over everything Gordon and I had spent 41 years building. My physiotherapist put her hand flat on my shoulder and said, very quietly, "Don't react. Just keep your eyes on the window and listen to me." Her name was Shelagh Morrow. I had been coming to her clinic on Elgin Street in Ottawa every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 months, since the fall when my hip replacement recovery was taking longer than anyone expected. She was 61, soft-spoken, with the kind of directness that comes from spending a career telling people things they don't want to hear about their own bodies. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has seen you at your worst and didn't look away. That Tuesday afternoon in March, she had me on the table doing hip flexor work, the same routine we'd done 100 times when she said it. Her voice was low enough that I'd almost thought I'd misheard her. "Your daughter's husband was in my waiting room this morning," she said. "He didn't see me come in through the back. He was on the phone." She pressed gently on my hip and said, "He was talking about your house." I kept my eyes on the window. Outside, the Rado Canal was still frozen. A man was walking a dog along the path. He said, "Once she signs Thursday, we won't need to manage her at all. The accountant says the transfer timeline is about 6 weeks from activation." And then the other person said something I couldn't hear, and he said, "She thinks it's for tax purposes. She still thinks that." I lay on the table and did not move. She said, "I've been going back and forth about whether to tell you. I've been going back and forth for 3 days. I'm sorry it took me this long." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I drove home along the Queensway and I didn't cry, which surprised me. Gordon had been gone for 4 years. We had been married in 1979 at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church on Wellington Street, and we had spent the next 4 decades doing what people like us do in Ottawa, working, saving, raising children in a semi-detached in Westboro, waiting for a life that turned out to be the one we already had. He had retired from the federal public service after 32 years. I had taught grade 3 at Elmwood for 27. Between us, we had built something modest and sufficient and entirely ours. The house on Thornton Avenue, worth about $780,000 in the current market, and an RRSP between us that had grown to just over $490,000, plus Gordon's indexed pension, which had transferred to me at 60% on his death. Our daughter, who I will call my daughter because that is what she is to me before she is anything else, had been after me for 2 years to get things organized. That was her phrase, get things organized. She'd said it first at Christmas the year after Gordon died, gently, over dinner, while her husband sat across from me with the patient expression of a man waiting for a process to complete. She'd said it again in the spring and again in the fall, and then last November she'd arrived with a man named Warren Finch, who she described as a financial and estate planning specialist, and Warren Finch had sat at my kitchen table and explained in pleasant, unhurried language that the most sensible thing I could do was establish a power of attorney document that gave my daughter full decision-making authority over my finances and property in the event that I became unable to manage them myself. I had asked what unable to manage meant. Warren Finch had smiled and said it was a standard threshold: cognitive decline, medical incapacity, extended hospitalization. He said, "At your stage of life with assets of this scale, the last thing you want is the province making decisions on your behalf." He said it very gently, the way you'd say something to someone who you'd already decided wasn't going to argue. I had not argued. I had said I would think about it. Thinking about it had turned into 4 months of slow, patient pressure from my daughter, who called more often than she had in years, who came for Sunday dinners and asked careful questions about how I was managing, whether I'd had any more of those moments where I lost the thread of a sentence, whether I was sleeping well. She said all of it with love in her voice. That is the thing I keep coming back to. There was love in her voice. I do not know yet whether love and calculation can live in the same person at the same time. I am still working on that. I pulled into the driveway on Thornton Avenue and sat in the car for a while. The maple Gordon and I had planted in 1992 was enormous now, bare and gray in the March light. I had promised myself I would never sell this house. I had meant it the way you mean things that don't seem to need saying. I went inside and stood in the kitchen. Then I called my oldest friend, a woman named Bea. Bea Calder. We had taught together at Elmwood for 19 years, shared a prep room, driven to and from school together for so long that I sometimes couldn't remember which one of us had started the conversation. She had moved to Kingston when her husband retired, but she answered on the first ring the way she always did. I told her what Shelagh had told me. I told her about Warren Finch and the power of attorney papers and the signing scheduled for Thursday afternoon at my daughter's home in Barhaven. Bea listened without interrupting, which she is very good at when it matters. She said, "You need to call Patricia Ouellette." Patricia Ouellette was a lawyer who had handled Gordon's estate. She was 63, a partner at a firm on Sparks Street, and had spent the first decade of her career doing elder law before moving into general estates practice. Bea had known her since law school. I called her office at 4 o'clock. Her assistant put me through within 20 minutes. Patricia listened. When I finished, she said 3 things. Don't sign anything Thursday. Don't let on to your daughter that anything has changed. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9. That night, I sat in the armchair in the living room, the one Gordon had reupholstered the year he retired because he said he was going to read every book he put off for 30 years. And I thought about the timeline. Warren Finch had come in November. The power of attorney documents had arrived by courier in January. My daughter had begun mentioning, in passing, small things I had apparently forgotten. A phone call I didn't remember. A dentist appointment I had mixed up. In February, she had very gently suggested I speak to her family doctor about memory screening, just as a baseline. She had even made the appointment. I had gone. The doctor was a man I'd never seen before. Not my regular GP who had retired, but a new one. My daughter had found and recommended a Dr. Alistair Vane, who had asked me a series of questions and told me my results were something to watch. I had told my daughter about the appointment. Of course I had. She had asked me how it went, and I had told her because I told her things, because she was my daughter. I thought about that for a long time in Gordon's chair. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor with a window that looked out over the Peace Tower. She met me herself, not her assistant, and she'd already made coffee. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning, and she took notes in a small spiral notebook with a green cover. And when I finished, she read back what she'd written and asked me to confirm it. Then she opened the power of attorney document that Warren Finch had sent me in January, the one I had not yet signed, and she read it in the way that lawyers read documents, which is nothing like the way the rest of us do. This is a continuing power of attorney for property, she said, with immediate activation, not springing activation. Immediate. The moment you sign this, your daughter has full legal authority over every financial decision, every property transaction, every account. There is no threshold required, no medical assessment, no incapacity determination. I said I thought it only activated if I became unable to manage. She looked at me steadily. That is not what this document says. She turned to the second page and pointed to a paragraph that I had read and not fully understood in January, and she translated it into plain language. My daughter, upon my signature, would have authority to make any financial transaction on my behalf, including property sales, RRSP withdrawals, and transfers between accounts, without notifying me in advance and without requiring my consent on a transaction-by-transaction-by-transaction-by-transaction basis. Did Warren Finch explain this to you? Patricia said. No. She set the document down and folded her hands on the desk. Tell me again about Dr. Vane. I told her. The appointment in February, the memory screening, the something to watch conclusion. I told her my daughter had recommended him. Patricia said your regular GP would know your baseline. A new physician, seeing you once, with no prior history and a referral from your daughter, a baseline assessment from that appointment could be used to support a narrative of cognitive decline if this ever went to a capacity review. She let that sit for a moment. I have someone I want you to speak with, she said. She wrote a name on a notepad page and slid it across. Her name is Gwen Nakashima. She spent 18 years with the RCMP in financial crimes before she retired. She consults now. She's very good and she's discreet. I took the paper. For Thursday, Patricia said. You're going to call your daughter and tell her you've come down with something. Nothing alarming. A cold, a stomach bug. You need 48 hours. I drove home through center town and parked in the driveway and sat looking at the maple tree for a while. Gordon had told me once, near the end, that the thing he worried about most was leaving me alone, not because he doubted me, but because the world had a way of locating people who were alone and deciding they were available. He hadn't been talking about anything specific. He just said it, and I told him to stop being morbid, and he'd laughed and dropped it. I thought about that now. Gwen Nakashima arrived at my house the following morning with a canvas tote bag that looked like she'd bought it at a museum gift shop and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a long time being underestimated and had made her peace with it. She was 64, originally from Vancouver, and had the particular quality of stillness that I associate with people who have learned to let other people do most of the talking. She sat at my kitchen table and listened to everything. She did not write anything down until I finished. Then she said, "May I see the power of attorney document and anything else Finch gave you?" I gave her the folder. She lived through it for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "Warren Finch. Is that the name on the letter?" "Yes," she said. "I'll need your daughter's full name and her husband's, the name of the firm Finch represents, and Dr. Vane's full name if you have it." I had most of it. She said she could find the rest. "One thing I want to ask you," she said, standing at the door when she left. "Your daughter, when she first brought up the power of attorney, when she first introduced you to Finch, did it feel like something she had planned, or did it feel like something she had been guided into?" I thought about that question for a long time. I thought about my daughter at 26 when she had married her husband at a small ceremony at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. I thought about how she had been in the years before that. Thoughtful and self-directed, and nothing like the careful, managed version of herself she had become in that marriage. I thought about how her husband finished her sentences, how he answered questions she hadn't been asked, how at every family dinner he had a way of summarizing what my daughter had just said in terms that were almost but not quite the same. "Both," I said finally. "I think she was guided into it, and then she chose to stay." Gwen nodded. "That's the hardest kind." She left. I made tea and sat at the table where Gordon and I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, and I tried to think about what I knew and what I still needed to understand. 2 days later, she called. She said she'd found some things and asked if she could come by that afternoon with Patricia. Patricia arrived at 2. Gwen arrived at 2:15 with her canvas tote and 2 folders and an expression that told me before she opened anything that what was inside was serious. The first folder was about Warren Finch. He was registered with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, but had operated primarily in Quebec and Ontario's Eastern Corridor. He had been the subject of a complaint filed with the FSHRA in 2020 by the family of a woman in Kingston, 71 years old, widowed, 2 adult children, who had lost signing authority over her own home after activating a power of attorney document Finch had prepared. The family had settled out of court. The settlement was sealed. A second complaint had been filed in 2022 by a woman in Pembroke, 68, same circumstances, same document structure. That complaint had been dismissed on a procedural technicality that Gwen described carefully as unusual. "The document he gave you," Patricia said, "mirrors the structure from the Kingston case, the immediate activation clause, the language around transaction authority. It's the same template." He had been doing this, finding women who were recently widowed, who had adult children, who presented as concerned and trustworthy, and who had enough in assets to make the process worthwhile. The second folder was about my son-in-law. He had worked, before he married my daughter, as a financial product sales representative for a firm in Toronto that had been censured by the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada in 2017 for misrepresenting fee structures to clients. He had left that firm in 2016, officially voluntarily, officially to pursue independent consulting work. Gwen had spoken to someone who had worked there at the same time, off the record. The conversation had covered what Gwen described as a mutually agreed departure. He had brought Warren Finch to my daughter, not the other way around. My daughter had framed it to me as her initiative, her worry about my future. But Finch had come through my son-in-law. The introduction was his. The third thing Gwen had found was about Dr. Alistair Vane. He had a valid license with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. He was a general practitioner. He had no specialty in geriatric medicine or neuropsychology. The memory screening tool he had used with me, Gwen had found the name of it from the clinic's intake form, was a standardized assessment designed for primary care use as a preliminary screening, not a diagnostic tool, and not a document that carried clinical weight. But it generated a report, and that report, in my file, with Dr. Vane's signature, was a document that said a 67-year-old woman had exhibited results warranting monitoring. If the power of attorney were ever challenged, Patricia said, or if you tried to revoke it after signing, that assessment combined with a subsequent evaluation by a physician of their choosing could be used to argue you lacked capacity at the time of signing. That's the sequence. I sat with that for a moment. Was my son-in-law involved in setting up the appointment with Vane? I asked. Gwen looked at her notes. The clinic was recommended by your son-in-law's family. His aunt is a patient there. Whether he specifically arranged the appointment or simply suggested the clinic, I can't say definitively. And my daughter? She made the appointment herself. She was present at the clinic. Gwen paused. Whether she understood what the assessment might be used for, I can't tell you that. I had been sitting with that question since the moment I'd heard my son-in-law's voice described by Shelagh in the treatment room. My daughter. My child. The one I had driven to swim practice at 6 a.m. for 4 years, who had called me from Halifax the night of her PhD defense because she'd needed to hear my voice, who had held my hand in a parking lot of the Queensway Carleton Hospital the night Gordon died and said nothing at all because there was nothing to say. I did not know whether she had understood what was being built around me. I knew that she loved me. I also knew that love and blindness can occupy the same space in a person for a very long time, particularly when the person doing the leading is skilled at making the destination look like safety. What do we do? I asked. Patricia looked at me. What would you like to do? I had been thinking about the woman in Kingston and the woman in Pembroke. And whoever came after me if I simply didn't sign and walked away quietly and let the whole thing dissolve without consequence. I want to reschedule for Sunday, I said, at my house. Tell my daughter I'm feeling better and I want to do it here on familiar ground. Invite my son-in-law and Finch as well. Patricia looked at me steadily. And then? And then I want to finish it properly. I spent Saturday making the house clean in the way that Gordon always said I cleaned when I was angry, methodically from top to bottom, every surface. I made a pot of soup, the vegetable and barley that had been Gordon's favorite, and I let it sit on the stove and fill the kitchen with the smell of every winter Sunday we'd had in this house. I sat at his desk and looked at his photograph for a while. I told him what I was about to do. I told him I wasn't sure it would go well. I told him I was going to do it anyway. Bea arrived from Kingston at noon, having driven 3 hours without being asked twice. She brought maple cookies from a bakery in Kingston because that is who she is. My neighbor Carol, who had lived beside us for 22 years and had known Gordon since before I did, arrived at 12:30 with his wife and the quiet, solid presence of someone who has seen enough of life to understand when their presence is the point. Patricia was already there. Gwen sat in the armchair in the living room with her tote bag and looked like she was waiting for a bus. At 2:45, I heard a car in the driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched my daughter and her husband come up the front walk. She was wearing the gray coat she'd bought in Montreal the Christmas before Gordon died. He was carrying a leather portfolio with both hands, the careful grip of a man who believed the next few hours were going to require him to manage something. Warren Finch's car came in behind them. I opened the door and smiled. My daughter hugged me. She smelled like the same shampoo she'd used since university. She said, "You look well, Mum." "How's the stomach thing?" "All better," I said. "Come in. There's soup." My son-in-law shook my hand and said the house looked lovely. Warren Finch did the same, with the smooth, moderate warmth of a man who had done this many times and found it went more smoothly when everyone was comfortable. I brought them into the dining room. The table was set and the power of attorney documents were laid out in the center. Bea and Carol and his wife sat along the far side. Patricia stood near the window. Gwen was already at the table. Finch took in the number of people in the room and recovered in about 2 seconds, which told me something. "Margaret," he said. He had always called me Margaret. "I don't think I'd had the chance to meet all of your guests." "No," I said. "You haven't." I sat at the head of the table. My daughter sat to my left. Her husband sat beside her, the portfolio in front of him. Finch took the seat directly across from me. "Before we go through the documents," Finch said, "I'd like to walk everyone through the key provisions just so we're all comfortable." "I'd like to say something first," I said. "Of course." I looked at my daughter. She was watching me with an expression I recognized. Attentive, careful, the expression she wore when she was preparing to gently redirect me to the version of the situation she had already decided was accurate. "Your father," I said, "asked me one thing before he died. He said, 'Marg, don't let anyone tell you what you can and can't handle, because people will. They'll mean well and they'll love you and they'll still do it because it's easier than trusting you.'" I paused. I told him he was being dramatic. My daughter's expression softened. "I kept thinking about that this week." I nodded to Gwen. She opened her tote bag and set 3 folders on the table. She did it without ceremony, the way you set down something that is simply true and does not require presentation. I looked at Warren Finch. "This document," I said, "activates immediately upon my signature. Not if I become incapacitated. Immediately." My daughter was told it was a safeguard for incapacity. "You never explained to her that it transfers full transactional authority from the moment I sign." I looked at my daughter. "He never told you that because the point was for you not to know until after." My son-in-law said, "I think there's been a miscommunication about." Patricia said clearly, "Mr. Finch, the immediate activation clause is on page 3, section 2.1. It is drafted in language that a non-lawyer reading quickly would interpret as a conditional provision. It is not. This is the same clause structure used in a power of attorney document Finch prepared for a client in Kingston, Ontario in 2019. That client lost transactional control of her home. The matter was settled out of court." My daughter turned to look at Finch. He said, "These comparisons are taken entirely out of context." I opened the first folder and turned it to face my daughter. Finch's name at the top. The FSARA complaint from Kingston. The Pembroke complaint. The dates, the structures, the women, both widowed, both in their late 60s, both in possession of homes and registered accounts substantial enough to make the process efficient. My daughter went very still. "I want to tell you about your husband's history," I said, and I looked at my son-in-law directly for the first time since he had come in. He met my eyes and did not look away, which I had expected, and which told me something. "Before you were married," I said, "you worked for a firm in Toronto that was censured by Ty Rock in 2017 for misrepresenting fee structures to clients. You left the year before the censure. You brought Warren Finch to this family. You introduced him as a recommendation from a colleague. He's not a colleague. He's someone you knew from before, and you know how this works, and you chose to do it anyway." He said, "That is a characterization, not a fact." Bea placed a printed document on the table in front of my daughter. I kept my eyes on my son-in-law. "You arranged for a doctor I had never met to conduct a memory screening on me in February. That screening produced a report. That report was going to be used after I signed Thursday to establish a baseline that could support a capacity challenge if I ever tried to revoke the power of attorney." I paused. "My daughter made the appointment. I don't think she knew what the appointment was for. I think she was told it was for my benefit, and she believed that because she loves me and wanted to protect me, and you used that." My daughter said in a voice I had not heard from her since she was about 12 years old, "What?" Finch stood up. "I don't think this conversation is productive." Patricia said, "Please sit down, Mr. Finch. There are 2 officers from the Ottawa Police Service Financial Crimes Unit currently outside. If you leave, I will make a call." Finch sat down. My daughter looked at her husband. He was looking at the folder in front of her. He was not looking at me. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the folder with the expression of a man performing a calculation. She said his name. He said, "This is not what it looks like." She said his name again. He said, "We needed a plan. You know what our situation is." You know what the mortgage is. I was trying to find a way forward. She said, a way forward. She said it the way you repeat something when you're trying to understand whether the words mean what you think they mean. He said, I wasn't going to hurt her. My daughter looked at the folder. She looked at the document. She looked at her mother. I watched my child do something very hard. I watched her look at the person sitting next to her and understand, fully, what she was looking at and not look away from it. Patricia said, Warren Finch, you are being referred to the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario and to the Ottawa Police Financial Crimes Unit for investigation of elder financial abuse and fraudulent document preparation. We are recommending criminal charges. The RCMP Financial Crimes Division will also be notified given the interprovincial pattern. She looked at my son-in-law. Your involvement is under review. The officers came to the door. Finch left. He looked in that moment like what he was, a man who had done this before and was accustomed to it not going this way. My son-in-law picked up his portfolio. He looked at my daughter. She did not look back. He walked past me without speaking and let himself out, and we heard the car in the driveway, and then it was quiet. My daughter sat at the table with her hands flat on the documents in front of her and did not move for a long time. Carol's wife put the kettle on in the kitchen because she is the kind of person who knows when to do that. Bea put her hand on my daughter's shoulder and left it there. Patricia gathered her documents the efficient way she always did, and she gave me a look that said what it needed to say without words, and she and Gwen and Carol and his wife moved to the kitchen to give us the room. My daughter and I sat at the table where she had done her homework for 12 years, where her father had helped her with calculus the winter she was 16 and furious about it, where we had eaten 10,000 meals. She said, How long have you known? 5 days. She put her face in her hands. I let her. After a while, she looked up. Her face was a mess and she didn't do anything about it, which told me something about the state she was in. She said, I thought he was trying to help. He said you were struggling. He said you'd mentioned forgetting things, that you seemed overwhelmed, that the house was too much. He said the power of attorney was standard. He said everyone was doing it. He said you'd be relieved once it was in place. And the doctor? I said. She closed her eyes. He said he'd found someone good. He said he'd take care of booking it. She opened her eyes. Mom, I know. I sat in that waiting room while you were in there. I thought... She stopped. I thought I was protecting you. I know you did. I should have asked you, she said. I should have come to you directly instead of going around you. I treated you like a problem to be managed. She said it the way someone says something they have just understood completely, not as an apology, but as a fact. They are making themselves hold. Yes, I said, you did. She didn't argue. She just looked at the table. We have to talk about all of it, I said. Not today, but soon. About how you got here. About what you saw in me that made this feel like the right thing to do. About what he told you and what you chose to believe and when those became the same thing. She nodded. But, I said, I need you to know something first. I know you love me. I know that the part of this that came from you came from love. And I am telling you that love and this, I touched the folder, are not incompatible. People do harm to the people they love all the time because they decide they know better. That is not a defense, but it is something to understand. My daughter looked at me. She had Gordon's eyes. She had always had his eyes. She said, are we, I don't know yet. I said honestly, but I am not ending it. I'm not interested in ending it. I'm interested in what comes after this, which I think is going to be harder than today. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. In the kitchen, I heard Carol's wife pour water. I heard Bea say something to Gwen. The house was full of people who had shown up for me, which was not something I had expected to feel today, and the feeling of it was large. In the weeks after, the quiet that came back to Thornton Avenue was different from the quiet of the 4 years since Gordon. Less hollow. More chosen, somehow. Shelagh called every week. Carol's wife brought food on Fridays, which she had not done before and which I did not discourage. Bea drove up from Kingston twice, once to help me go through the filing cabinet in Gordon's study and once just to sit in the kitchen and talk, and both times were necessary. Warren Finch surrendered his registration with the FSRA in June, pending the investigation. Criminal charges were laid in September. The woman in Kingston, through her family's lawyer who Patricia had been in contact with, had been formally notified that the investigation encompassed her case. The woman in Pembroke as well. 4 other women came forward through the RCMP investigation. Women who had been alone and who had trusted an advisor at a vulnerable moment and who had not had a Shelagh Moreau standing in the right room at the right time. Whatever happened in court, that part felt like something. Dr. Pear. Vane was referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario for failing to disclose a referral relationship and conducting an assessment in circumstances that created a conflict of interest. His file was under review. My daughter's husband moved out of their house in May. She told me this in a phone call that was short and careful and getting incrementally less short as the months went by. She had started seeing a counselor. She said the counselor was helping her understand something about how she had learned, somewhere along the way, to outsource her judgment to people who seemed more certain than she was. She said it in the way of someone who is partway through a very uncomfortable understanding and is keeping going anyway. I had my own cognitive assessment done in April at the memory clinic at the Ottawa Hospital through a referral from my own GP, the new one I had found myself, a woman named Dr. Meinel. UN, who had been practicing for 30 years and had the calm, frank manner of someone with nothing to prove. The assessment took 2 sessions. The report was unambiguous. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Memory, executive function, and processing speed all within normal range for my age. She told me, near the end of the 2nd session, that I had pointed out a scoring inconsistency in one of the subtests and been correct. She said most of her patients didn't do that. I told Gordon about it when I went to the cemetery in May. The lilacs were starting along the fence, and the afternoon was the first truly warm day of the year, the kind of day that arrives in Ottawa like an apology for February. I sat with him for a while and told him about all of it, the nail clinic, the folders, the dining room table, the officers at the door. I told him our daughter was finding her way back. I told him the house was still there. I told him I was going to plant something new in the garden this summer because the beds along the back fence had been the same for 8 years and it was time. The wind moved through the lilacs. I drove home along the river and through the glebe and over the bridge and into Westboro, the way I had driven home for 30 years. And I pulled into the driveway and looked at the maple tree, which was putting out its first leaves, small and tentative and very green. And I thought that it had been growing since 1992 and that I had been watching it all that time and had somehow never noticed how big it had gotten. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I sat at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of a house that is only yours and that you are not afraid of losing anymore. My daughter called that evening. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She asked if she could come for dinner next Sunday. She said, just the 2 of us, if that's all right, and I could hear in the way she said it that she was not certain of the answer. I said yes. I said, come at noon and we'll have the whole day. After we hung up, I sat for a while in Gordon's chair and thought about how strange it is that the things most worth protecting are almost never the things you think you're protecting. I had spent 5 days protecting the house, the accounts, the numbers, and all of that had been worth protecting. I am not saying it wasn't. But what I had actually protected, sitting at the head of my dining room table on a Sunday afternoon with soup on the stove and people who loved me around the room, was something harder to name. The right to be taken seriously. The right to be the person who decides what happens to a life I built. Gordon had known what he was talking about. If you stayed with me through all of this, I want to tell you something I have been sitting with since the day Shelagh put her hand on my shoulder in that clinic. The thing that almost happened to me did not begin with Warren Finch. It did not begin with my son-in-law and his portfolio. It began earlier, in the long quiet after Gordon died, when I pulled away from my daughter the way I pull away from everyone when I am not all right. I am competent at everything except letting people see that I am not coping. I have been that way my whole life. I closed the door and my daughter saw a closed door and someone who was waiting told her it was declined. That was his mistake to make, and she was wrong to accept it. I am not excusing either of those things, but I helped make the space, the people who look for openings. And there are people who look for openings, who make a study of grief and solitude and the particular vulnerability of someone who has recently lost the person who knew them best. They need a gap to work with. Sometimes the gap is cut by a dishonest man with a registration number and a briefcase full of documents, but sometimes it begins with a mother and a daughter who stopped talking honestly to each other before anyone arrived with anything to sign. Keep the door open, whatever it costs you to keep it open. Thank you for being here with me for this. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever sat across from someone you love and realized the story they were telling themselves about you wasn't the one you were living, I would be glad to hear about it. I read every comment. And if you're not already subscribed to Gemstone Revenge, I hope you'll stay. There's more I want to share with you. I have been sitting with something since the Sunday afternoon when I watched my son-in-law walk out of this house without looking back. The thing I keep returning to is not what Warren Finch did. It is not even what my son-in-law chose. Those things are what they are, and the legal process will do what it does. And I have made my peace with the fact that I will not control how that ends. What I keep returning to is the gap, the space that existed before anyone arrived with a folder or a form or a referral to a doctor I had never met. That gap was mine. I made it. After Gordon died, I did what I have always done when I am not coping. I became very capable in public and very closed in private. I answered the phone. I managed the paperwork. I showed up to things. And I did not let my daughter in. Not really, because letting her in would have meant letting her see that I was frightened, and I have never been good at being seen frightened. I have been good at being competent. Competence was the thing I knew how to perform, and so I performed it, and she watched from the outside of a closed door, and someone told her what it meant, and she believed him because he was standing right there and I was not. That is the part that took me the longest to sit with, honestly. Not that she failed me. She did, in the way that people fail each other when they stop checking their own understanding against the actual person in front of them. But I had given her very little to check against. I had made myself a version of fine, and versions of fine are easy to reinterpret. What I understand now on the other side of all of it is that the choices we make in grief, the small daily choices about whether to let people see us or to manage what they see, those choices accumulate. They become a story that other people read. And we don't always get to choose who is doing the reading or what they decide it means. I am not saying I caused what happened. I am saying that Shelagh was in the right room at the right moment and Bea drove 3 hours without being asked twice. And Patricia read a document in a way I had not. And Carol and his wife sat at my table because I had spent 22 years being a neighbor worth showing up for. The people who helped me were the people I had stayed open to. That was not an accident. The intelligence to understand what is happening to you, the ethics to respond to it honestly rather than conveniently, the endurance to keep going when what you have understood is hard, those things do not arrive fully formed in a crisis. They are built in ordinary time, in the small decisions about whether to stay present to your own life or to manage the appearance of it from a careful distance. My daughter is working on something difficult right now. I watch her in our Sunday phone calls and the careful way she chooses her words, in the questions she asks that she would not have thought to ask a year ago. She is learning something about how she gave her judgment away and called it love. That is slow work. It does not resolve in an afternoon, but it is the right work, and I think she is the kind of person who, once she understands something truly, does not go back. Gordon would have been glad of that. He always said she had more steel in her than she let herself use. I think he was right. I think he was right. I think I am watching her find it. "Don't open that door," my housekeeper said, grabbing my arm in the hallway. "Not yet. Please, just come with me first." I looked at her. 61 years on this earth, and I have learned to read people. Hilda had worked for our family for 9 years. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not grab arms. She did not whisper in hallways. "What is it?" I said. She shook her head and pulled me toward the back staircase. "Not here." That morning had started the way I always imagined my son's wedding morning would start. Coffee before anyone else was awake. The good coffee, the dark roast from the little shop on Elgin Street that my husband used to love. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe with both hands wrapped around the mug, and I let myself feel it, the particular ache of a milestone happening without him. My husband Roland. No, that's not right. I'm getting ahead of myself. My son's name is Callum. He's 34. He has his father's jaw and his grandmother's stubbornness, and a laugh so big it fills whatever room he's in. I raised him alone after his father, my husband Warren, died of a heart attack 7 years ago. Not entirely alone. We had Hilda and we had each other. But you know what I mean. The kind of alone that matters. The decisions, the worry, the 2 a.m. thoughts that you can't share with anyone because there is no one to share them with anymore. When Callum told me he was marrying Petra, no, Petra is on the list. I need a different name. Her name was Simone. No, that's on the list too. Her name was Darcy. Darcy Nowland, she said, the first time Callum brought her home for dinner. She had that easy confidence some people carry, the kind that makes a room tilt toward them. She was 31. She told me she worked in project management for a commercial real estate firm in Ottawa. She had a golden retriever named Biscuit and an apartment in Sentrytown and a way of laughing at Callum's jokes just a half second before the punchline that, at the time, I thought meant she adored him. I wanted to adore her too. I tried. There was something though, not a specific thing I could point to. More like standing in a room and knowing a window is open somewhere you can't see. A slight wrongness in the air, a chill you can't source. I mentioned it once to my sister and she told me I'd been alone too long and was subconsciously sabotaging my son's happiness. I decided she was probably right and kept my mouth shut. The engagement was 14 months long. The wedding was planned for late October at a restored Heritage Inn outside of Perth, Ontario. Beautiful place. Stone walls, maple trees turning, the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting. Darcy handled most of the planning. She had opinions about flowers and seating charts and the exact temperature of the venue, and I stayed out of it because Callum seemed happy and because I had learned in my 61 years that the best thing a mother of the groom can do is stay out of it. The morning of the wedding, I was in my room at the inn by 6:30. I had been awake since 4. I told myself it was excitement. I called my sister, got her voicemail, left a message that was mostly just me breathing into the phone and saying, "Today's the day," 3 times in a slightly unhinged way. I got dressed. Dark green dress, my good pearl earrings. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I went downstairs to find coffee. That was when Hilda found me in the hallway. She took me to the small sitting room off the main lobby, the one with the deep chairs and the fireplace that was already lit even though it was only 9 in the morning. She closed the door. "Sit down," she said. "Hilda, please sit." I sat. She stood in front of me with her hands clasped together in a way she had. Hilda clasped her hands when she was bracing herself. I had seen it twice before. Once when she had to tell me the cat had gotten out and been hit on the street. Once when she found the lump that turned out, thank God, to be nothing. "I saw something last night," she said. "After dinner. I couldn't sleep, so I went down to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The back kitchen, through the garden path." I waited. "There's a man staying here," she said. "In the East Wing. I don't know his name, but he was in the garden with Darcy." "Darcy," I repeated. They were arguing, quietly. You know how people argue when they don't want to be heard. I stopped. I didn't mean to listen, but I couldn't move. She paused. "He said," and I'm telling you exactly what he said. He said, "You told me this was almost done. You said by Christmas it would be done." And she said, "It will be. It just takes time. He has to trust me completely first." And he said, "I'm not waiting anymore, Darcy. I have waited long enough. You made me a promise and you had better keep it." The fireplace crackled. "He," I said. "He means Callum?" Hilda nodded. "And done means, I don't know exactly," she said, "but I thought." She stopped, started again. Your son inherited quite a lot when Warren passed. The property in the valley. The investment accounts. I thought you should know before the ceremony. Yes. I sat there in the green dress with the pearl earrings and I felt, very precisely, the floor shift under me. Not metaphorically. I felt it in my actual body, in my feet and my hands, that physical sensation of the ground being less solid than you thought it was. I wanted to be wrong. I want to tell you I kept a clear head and immediately knew what to do. That is not what happened. What happened is I sat in that chair for probably 3 full minutes without moving, while Hilda watched me and the fire made its sounds, and somewhere upstairs, my son was getting dressed to marry a woman who had been in a garden the night before, telling someone that he just needed to trust her. Completely first. Who is this man? I said finally. What does he look like? Older than her? Maybe 50. Dark hair going gray. I saw him at breakfast yesterday. He was sitting alone by the window. He was on his phone the whole time. Do you know if he's still here? His car was in the east lot when I walked past at 7. I stood up. All right, I said. Don't tell Callum anything yet. Don't tell anyone. Let me think. I found the man at breakfast. He was exactly where Hilda had described, alone, by the window. Coffee and eggs he was barely touching. Phone face down on the table. He was wearing a collared shirt, no tie. The particular studied casualness of someone who is used to wearing a tie but has decided not to today. 50, 55. Nice watch. The kind of face that might have been handsome once and had since gone somewhere harder. I sat down at the table next to his. I ordered coffee. I opened my phone and pretended to read something. I am 61 years old, and I have attended hundreds of community meetings and school board hearings and fundraising galas and one extremely contentious condo association AGM, and I have learned how to listen to 2 conversations at once. I am also, if I'm being honest, the sort of woman who people tend to underestimate. Older, gray hair, sensible jewelry. I'm furniture. I'm background. Nobody worries about what I'm hearing. He made a phone call at 9:47. He turned toward the window when he answered, which meant he turned away from the other tables and directly, unknowingly, toward me. It's today, he said. Yeah, I know. A pause. She's been at this for 8 months. I know what I said. His voice dropped lower. She promised me half. That's the arrangement. If she gets what she's going for, I get half, and she has one more shot at getting it done before I do what I said I'd do. Another pause, longer this time. She said there's a property in Lanark County, and accounts. She said the accounts alone are. He stopped. Listened. I know it sounds insane. I know, but she has done this before. That's why He stopped again. Yeah. All right. I'll let you know how it goes. He hung up. Turned back to his eggs. I sat very still with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. She has done this before. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed in my room and I did not allow myself to cry because if I started, I was not confident I would stop in time. I thought about Warren. I thought about how he used to say, trust what you know, Bev. No, my name in this story isn't Bev. My name is Francis. Trust what you know, Francis, he used to say. You know more than you think you do. What did I know? I knew that the chill I had felt for 14 months was not loneliness or sabotage or a mother's selfishness. I knew that Darcy Nallon had made promises to a man I had never seen before about my son's assets. I knew the phrase, she has done this before, was sitting in my chest like a stone. I knew the ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock and it was now 10:15. I knew I could not let my son walk into this. But I also knew what I had, the word of my housekeeper and a phone call I had overheard from a stranger. No documents, no records, nothing that Callum could hold in his hands. He loved this woman. He had planned a life with her. If I walked into his room right now and said, I don't think you should marry Darcy with nothing more than what I had, he would look at me the way children sometimes look at their mothers, With that particular mix of pity and frustration, that means they think you are afraid and old and possibly coming a little undone, and I would lose him, at least for a while. I needed more. I picked up my phone and called my nephew Theo. No, Theo is on the list. I called my nephew Griffin. He's 29, works in cybersecurity in Toronto, and is the sort of person you want on your side when things go sideways. He answered on the second ring. "Aunt Frances," he said. "I need you to look someone up for me," I said. "Right now. Her name is Darcy Nowlin, Ottawa. She says she works in project management, commercial real estate. I need to know if that's true, and I need to know if that's true, and I need to know if there's anything else." A pause. "It's your son's wedding today." "I know, Griffin. Is everything okay?" "No," I said. "I don't think it is. Please." He was quiet for a moment. "Give me 30 minutes. I went to find the man with the gray streaked hair. He had moved from the dining room to the small lounge near the front entrance. He was reading something on his phone, and he had gotten what appeared to be a second coffee. Up close, he looked tired in a specific way. Not sleepy, but depleted, like someone who has been managing a situation for a long time and is nearly out of patience. I sat across from him. He looked up. "Good morning," I said. He nodded. Not unfriendly, but not open. "I'm Francis," I said. "My son is getting married here today." Something moved across his face. "Very briefly, congratulations," he said. "Thank you." I kept my voice pleasant. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Are you a guest of the bride or the groom?" A pause. "Neither," he said. I have a room here. Passing through." "Lovely choice," I said. "It's a beautiful property." And then, because I had come this far and because Warren always said I knew more than I thought I did, "Her name is Darcy, isn't it? The bride." The color in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not a movie reaction. Just a tightening, a stilling, the way water looks just before it freezes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think you know her," I said. Quietly, pleasantly. The way I used to talk to parents at school board meetings when I wanted them to tell me something they hadn't planned to tell me, something they hadn't planned to tell me. "I think she asked you here, or you came to make sure she followed through on something. Either way," I set my coffee down. "I'm his mother, and I would like to know what my son has walked into." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he put his phone face down on the table, which is what he had done at breakfast too, and I realized it was a habit, a shutting down, a closing off. But he didn't get up. He didn't walk away. "Her name isn't Darcy Nowlin," he said finally. His voice was low. "I don't know what name she's using." I kept very still. "What do you mean? Her real name is—" "It doesn't matter. What matters is she's done this twice before. She finds someone with assets, savings, property. She builds it slowly. Engagement, marriage, and then—" He stopped. "She was my partner 3 years ago, not romantically. Business. We ran a home renovation company in Calgary. She was the face of it. I handled the back end. She was." He exhaled. "She was very good at making people trust her. And then she disappeared with $63,000 of client deposits and left me holding the liability." The fire in the lobby crackled from 2 rooms away. "And you followed her here," I said. "I found her 6 months ago. In Ottawa, I watched her. I saw the whole thing developing, the relationship, the ring. I thought." He looked at his hands. "I thought if I waited until she had something to lose, she'd give me what she owes me. Pay me back, quietly." He paused. "I know it sounds like you have been trying to get your money back," I said. "And she has been stalling you." He nodded. "Do you have documentation," I said, "of what she did in Calgary? Records, anything?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He opened something, turned it toward me. "Bank transfer records, a company name. Receipts. A complaint filed with the Calgary Police Service, case number and date visible." I looked at it for 5 full seconds. "Can you send those to me?" I said. He sent them. My phone buzzed at the same time with a message from Griffin. Darcy Nowlin doesn't exist. No record in CRA, no LinkedIn, no business registry. Did find a woman, matching description. Chandra Merritt, fraud charges in Alberta 2021, case withdrawn due to insufficient evidence at trial. She moved east after. Do you want me to keep going? I wrote back, no. I have what I need. Thank you. It was 11:40. The ceremony was at 2. I had enough time to do this right. I went upstairs and knocked on my son's door. He opened it in his dress shirt, tie not yet on, hair still damp from the shower. He looked happy in a way that broke something in me, because I was about to change his day irrevocably, and there was no version of this that didn't hurt him. Mum, he said, smiling, you look great. Is everything… Can I come in? Something in my voice reached him. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Got careful. He stepped back and let me in. I closed the door. I sat down in the chair by the window. I said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you respond. Can you do that? He sat on the edge of the bed. You're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry. I took a breath. Her name isn't Darcy Nowlin. I will not tell you the next 40 minutes were easy. They were not. He was angry. Not at her, at first. At me. He stood up. He said I had always had a problem with Darcy, and I was doing this on his wedding day of all days. He said his father would be ashamed of me. That one landed, as it was designed to, and I let it land and I sat with it, and I did not cry, and I did not get defensive, and I said, look at the documents, Callum. Just look at them, Talthium. He looked at them, the bank records, the police case number, Griffin's message about Chandra Merritt, the withdrawal of the charges and the timeline of her moving east. The way it lined up precisely with when Darcy Nowlin had appeared in Ottawa and started working in the world of real estate and commercial property, a world where you meet people with assets, where trust is built slowly over contracts and handshakes and client dinners. He sat with his phone in his hands for a long time without saying anything. The property, he said finally. His voice was different now, flatter. She asked me last week to put her name on the Valley property, jointly. Before the wedding, I said I wanted to wait until after, get a lawyer involved, and she… He stopped. She was upset. She was upset. She said it was a trust thing, that she shouldn't have to ask. He looked up at me. I thought I was being paranoid. You weren't being paranoid, I said. She has a dog, he said, and it was such an unexpected human thing to say that my throat closed completely. She has a dog named Biscuit, and she has and knows the names of my friends from university, and she knows how I take my coffee, and she taught… I know, I said. I know. He put his face in his hands. I went and sat next to him on the bed the way I used to sit next to him when he was 7 and have a nightmare, and I put my hand on his back, and I didn't say anything else for a while. He's the one who called the RCMP. I want to be clear about that. He picked up the phone and he made the call himself, calmly and clearly, and he sat on the phone with them for 20 minutes, and then we sat together and waited. The guests were in the ceremony room when the officers arrived. The inn manager was tremendously professional about it. I'll say that. Darcy, Chandra, was in her suite getting the final touches on her veil when there was a knock at the door. She had brought a friend to help her dress, a woman who later told the officers she had genuinely believed she was at a real wedding and had no knowledge of anything. I did not go. I stayed with Callum. We sat in his room and he stared at the wall, and I sat next to him, and at one point he said, "How did you know?" And I said, "Hilda saw her in the garden last night." And he said, "Of course it was Hilda." And the tiniest, most broken version of a laugh came out of him. And I thought, we will get through this. It will take time, but we will get through this. The inn handled the guest with extraordinary grace. The manager told them there had been a family emergency, that the ceremony would not be going ahead, that rooms were complimentary for the night for anyone who needed to stay. Some people came to find us. Callum's best friend knocked on the door, and Callum let him in, and that was when I knew it was all right for me to leave. It's been 4 months since that morning. Callum he's not okay yet, but he's getting there. He's been staying close to home, working hard, going to the gym. He had 4 sessions with a counselor in Ottawa that he told me about and then stopped telling me about, which I'm choosing to interpret as a good sign, as in private and processing rather than stopped going. I have learned that Chandra Merritt has been charged. There are investigators looking at what happened in 2 other provinces as well. The man at the inn, his name is Boyd. I have spoken to him twice since, has been cooperating with the police and is pursuing civil recovery through a lawyer in Calgary. He is not a good man exactly. He knew what she was doing, and he was trying to profit from it in his own way. But he was also, in the end, the reason Hilda overheard what she needed to hear in that garden, and the reason I had documentation to show my son instead of just a mother's feeling. Sometimes good information comes from imperfect places. That is a thing I have had to make my peace with. Warren, if he were here, would say something sensible about that. He always could take the complicated thing and find the reasonable sentence that lived inside it. I miss that. I miss it every day, but I missed it especially sitting on that bed in the October light, watching our son figure out that the person he loved had never existed at all. But I also keep thinking about something else. I keep thinking about that chill I felt for 14 months, that open window I could never find. I kept my mouth shut because I was told I was afraid and old and perhaps coming a little undone. And maybe that was part of it, but that chill was also real, and it knew something before I did. And I think I have decided, actually, that in the time I have left on this earth, I am going to stop apologizing for knowing things. Hilda is still with us, obviously. I gave her a raise and the rest of the month off. She spent it, I believe, visiting her sister in Kelowna, which she has been meaning to do for 3 years. Callum texted me last week. A photo of himself at a farmer's market. A good coat, a paper cup of coffee, squinting into the winter sun. The caption said, "Found the good dark roast. Thought of you." I cried a little at my kitchen table, the good kind. I have been thinking about cause and effect a lot since that October morning in Perth. Not in any grand or cosmic sense. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score or that everything happens for a reason in some tidy, prearranged way. I don't think that. Life is too messy and too painful for me to believe that. What I do believe, what that morning confirmed for me, is that the choices people make accumulate. Quietly, invisibly, over months and years, they stack up. And eventually, the weight of them becomes impossible to hide. Darcy, Chandra, had made a series of choices long before she ever met my son. She had chosen, somewhere along the way, to build her life on other people's trust, not once, but repeatedly. Calgary, then somewhere else, then Ottawa. Every time she walked away with what she'd taken, she probably told herself she was clever, smarter than the people she left behind, and maybe she was for a while. But every choice she made also left a trail. A man named Boyd who was furious and determined, a case number in a police database, a pattern that, once someone looked closely enough, was impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. That is the thing about living dishonestly. It does not just affect the moment. It builds a kind of debt, not a moral debt in any religious sense, just a practical human one. Every deception requires another deception to support it. Every lie needs a story around it. And the more elaborate the construction, the more people have to be fooled, and the greater the chance that one of them, a housekeeper who can't sleep, a mother who orders coffee at the wrong table at the right moment, is paying closer attention than you counted on. Callum made choices too, and I want to be honest about that. He chose to trust quickly. He chose, when I raised small concerns early on, to hear those concerns as fear rather than instinct. That is not a criticism of him. It is one of the most human things there is, to want the story you are living to be the good one. But I think he understands now that trust, real trust, is something that is built slowly and tested over time. Not because people are untrustworthy by nature, but because trust without discernment isn't really trust at all. It is just hope wearing trust's coat. And then there's me. I kept my mouth shut for 14 months because I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of being the difficult mother, the lonely widow who couldn't let her son be happy. That fear cost us nothing in the end because Hilda was in that garden, but it could have cost us everything. I made a choice in that sitting room when Hilda told me what she'd heard to act on what I knew rather than wait for permission to know it. That choice, that one decision to stop apologizing for my own instincts, is the one I am most grateful for. I am 61 years old. I have raised a good man. I have buried a good husband. I have sat in enough difficult rooms to know that the people who come through hard things are not the ones who are never afraid. They are the ones who were afraid and kept thinking anyway. Who stayed present when they wanted to disappear? Who said the hard thing out loud even when their voice was shaking? Callum is going to be all right. He already is, in most of the ways that matter. And I am going to keep trusting what I know. That is enough. That is enough. I was in the upstairs hallway pulling on my good earrings when Marta grabbed my wrist. Not touched my arm, grabbed it, the way you grab someone who's about to step off a curb without looking. I turned around and she was already shaking her head, eyes wide, finger pressed to her lips. Marta has worked in my house for 19 years. She has never once raised her voice. She has never come upstairs without being asked. And she had never, not once in all those years, looked at me the way she was looking at me right then. She pointed down the hallway toward the guest room. My daughter was in there. My daughter and her fiancé, who had arrived 2 days earlier from Calgary to help us celebrate my youngest grandson's graduation dinner. The whole family was downstairs getting ready. I could hear my son calling up, asking if anyone had seen his jacket. Marta leaned close to my ear. "Do not go in there," she whispered. "And please, don't let them know you're here." I almost laughed. I almost said, "Marta, what on earth are you talking about?" But her hand was still on my wrist and her face was completely serious. I have known this woman through the death of my husband, through a cancer scare, through the flood that destroyed our basement in 2018. She does not frighten easily. I stood very still. The door was not latched. It never latches properly. We've been meaning to fix it for years. And through that narrow gap, I heard my daughter's voice. I heard everything. My daughter's name is Sylvie. She is 41 years old. She was born on a Wednesday morning in October, and I remember exactly what the light looked like coming through the hospital window. I have loved her the way you love someone who came from inside your own body, the way that has no logic to it and doesn't need any. She was talking about me. She was talking about me the way you talk about a problem, a logistical obstacle, something to be managed until it becomes irrelevant. Her fiancé, I'll call him what he was talking too. I had never trusted him, not quite, not in the way you trust someone you truly believe means well for your child. He was pleasant enough, always pleasant, the kind of pleasant that covers something else. I used to tell myself I was being unfair. I was not being unfair. What I heard him say was this, that it had to happen before the spring, that once the transfer went through, the wording of my original will was no longer going to protect what I thought it was protecting. He said it the way someone says it who has read the documents, who has read them more than once. And my daughter said, "She trusts me completely. That's not going to be a problem." I stopped breathing. I want to be very clear about what that sentence did to me. It wasn't anger, not first. It was something physical, like the floor had dropped away, like I was standing on nothing. I had trusted her completely. That was true. I had named her as executor of my estate. I had given her signing authority over the family trust when my husband died, because she was the organized one, the careful one, the one who always came to the meetings and asked the right questions. My son is a good man, but he's never been interested in paperwork. That was always Sylvie. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Marta was beside me. She had let go of my wrist by then. We didn't look at each other. We just listened. They talked about timing, about the cottage in the Gatineau, whether it made more sense to sell it before or after a certain point, about something he called the amendment, which I did not understand then, but came to understand very clearly later, about how my son wasn't a concern because he had no idea what was in the trust documents. At one point, Sylvie said, "I just need a few more weeks." She's being completely reasonable about everything. Reasonable. I had thought we were just getting along well. I had thought the last few months had been some kind of turning point for us. They weren't. Eventually, they came downstairs. I came downstairs too, a few minutes later, through the back staircase. Marta brought me a glass of water in the kitchen and stood across from me, and I could see she'd been holding this for a while. I could see it had been eating at her. "How long have you known?" I asked. She said she'd heard pieces of it before. A phone call a few months ago. A conversation the last time they visited. She said she hadn't been sure enough to say anything. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. We went to the graduation dinner. I sat across from my daughter and I watched her pour wine for everyone and tell a story that made the table laugh and put her hand on my arm twice and say, "Mum, you look wonderful tonight." And I smiled. I smiled through the whole thing. That was one of the harder nights of my life. Not because I was heartbroken, though I was, but because I had to make a decision about how to handle what I knew, and I had to make it while passing the bread and listening to my grandson talk about his plans for university. I had to make it without letting anything show. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name is Wendell, and he has been my family solicitor for 22 years, and he picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed to come in. I told him it was urgent, and I asked him not to mention it to anyone else in the office for the time being. He asked no questions. That's the thing about people who have known you for a long time. They hear the weight in your voice and they respond to it without requiring an explanation first. I went in on the Thursday. I brought my original will, the trust documents, and the folder of financial records I keep in the back of the cabinet in my office. Wendell read everything I brought and asked me some questions I had not expected and showed me 3 things in the documents that I had not noticed before. He was careful with his language. He said things like, "This could potentially allow for," and "depending on interpretation," but what he was telling me was that my daughter, as executor, had access to mechanisms that would not require my active participation, that there were things she could do within the letter of what I'd signed that I had not intended when I signed them. I asked him how long it would take to fix. He said, "That depends on what you want it to look like when we're done." We spent 4 hours in that office. By the end of it, I had a revised trust structure, a new executor named my son, who cried a little when I called him that evening, which I had not expected from a 53-year-old man, and a very clear picture of what had nearly happened. The cottage stayed. That was one thing I was firm about. My husband built that cottage with his own hands, or mostly his own hands. We bought the land in 1987, and he spent 3 summers framing it out on weekends. My daughter was not getting that cottage. Not under any circumstances. I also made a change that I had not planned to make when I walked into Wendell's office, but that felt completely obvious by the time I left. I added Marta to my will. Not a token amount, a real one. Enough to matter. Enough to acknowledge what 19 years of loyalty actually looks like when you put it next to blood that turned out to mean something different than you thought. I did not confront my daughter right away. I want to explain that because some people, when I've told parts of this story, have said they wouldn't have waited, and I understand that. But I had spent 41 years raising this woman, and I did not want to do it in anger. I wanted to do it clearly. I waited 2 weeks. She came back to Ottawa for a long weekend at the end of the month. She was supposed to be helping me go through some boxes in the storage room, which in retrospect tells you something about the level of access she had made herself comfortable with. And we sat down at the kitchen table after lunch. I told her what I had heard. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, at least not until later. I just told her I was in the hallway. Marta was with me. We heard the conversation you had with him in the guest room the night of the graduation dinner. She went very white. She started to say something and then stopped. She tried a different thing and stopped again. She looked at the table for a long time. Then she said, "How much did you hear?" I said, "Enough to call Wendell the next morning." That landed. I could see it land. She knew what it meant, that whatever she had been planning had already been undone, that I had not sat on what I knew and given her more time to act on it. And here is the thing I was not prepared for, the thing I still think about. She started crying, not the kind of crying that's meant to get you something, the kind that happens when something breaks open. She put her hands over her face and she cried. And I sat across from her and I didn't move toward her and I didn't move away from her. And eventually she looked up and she said, "I don't know when I became someone who would do this to you." That sentence, that one sentence. I have turned it over many times in the months since. I think it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in a long time, maybe longer than I want to know. She told me the whole thing then, how it had started, how he had first brought it up as a kind of theoretical conversation about protecting assets, and she had not seen it clearly for what it was, how it had shifted, gradually, until she was participating in something she hadn't consciously signed up for, or that was what she told herself. I don't know how much of that was true and how much was what you tell yourself after you've been caught. I may never know. What I do know is that the relationship between my daughter and that man ended within 6 weeks of that conversation. She ended it herself. I did not ask her to. I didn't say a word about him after the day she told me everything because it wasn't my decision to make. But she ended it, and she came back to me in pieces, the way someone comes back when they've looked at themselves clearly and didn't like what they found. It has been almost a year now. We are in a different place. Not where we were before, because you don't go back to before once you know what you know, but somewhere. A place where she calls me more than she used to and says things she actually means, and where I can look at her across a table without that hollow feeling I had for those first months. I took her to the cottage in July, just the two of us for 4 days. We didn't talk about what happened the whole time we were there. We swam. We made coffee in the mornings and sat on the dock. One afternoon there was a thunderstorm and we sat inside and played cribbage the way we hadn't done since she was a teenager. On the last evening, I told her about Marta, about what I'd changed in the documents. I told her not because I wanted her to feel bad about it, but because Marta deserved to be acknowledged out loud. Sylvie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "She's always been better to you than I have." I said, "She's been different. You're my daughter." That doesn't excuse anything. No, I said, it doesn't, but it means something anyway. I don't know if I fully believe that. I'm still working it out. I think that's honest. What I do believe, very clearly, is that loyalty is not guaranteed by closeness. It is not a function of how long you've known someone or how much of yourself you've given them. Some of the most loyal people in your life will be the ones who never had any obligation to be, who stayed because they chose to every single day for 19 years without ever asking for anything in return. Marta knows what I changed in the documents. I told her myself, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in October. She looked at me for a long moment and then she looked away and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know I didn't have to." She made us both tea and we didn't say anything else about it. That is also a thing I love about her. The way she knows when a thing has been said and doesn't need to be said again. My grandson graduated with honors. He is going into environmental science at the University of Guelph in September. He has no idea what happened the night of his graduation dinner, and I intend to keep it that way for a long time, possibly forever. That evening was his. The mess of it was mine, and I am the one who had to carry it. And in some ways, I am grateful I was the one who got to. The earrings are still on my dresser. I put them on for the first time last month, for a friend's birthday dinner. They're just pearl studs, nothing remarkable. But for a few months, I couldn't look at them without feeling the way I felt in that hallway. I'm past that now, mostly. If you had asked me 2 years ago whether my daughter was capable of what she was planning, I would have said no, not Sylvie. And I think that certainty, that absolute trust, was part of why it nearly worked. I don't say that to warn you away from trusting the people you love. You have to trust the people you love. That's not negotiable. But I think now that trust is not a thing you give once and walk away from. It is something you stay present with, something you keep your eyes open inside of. And when someone who has no reason to do so, no stake in it, no angle, nothing to gain, pulls you into a hallway and tells you to listen, you listen. I am very glad I listened. I thought a lot about what it actually takes to do the right thing when the right thing costs you something. Marta could have stayed quiet. She had no legal obligation to tell me anything. She had no financial stake in what happened either way. What she had was 19 years of watching our family, of knowing what was true and what wasn't, and the kind of character that doesn't let you walk past something wrong just because walking past it would be easier. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very rare thing, and I don't think I understood how rare until I was standing in that hallway beside her. What she did took honesty, not the easy kind, not correcting a wrong order at a restaurant or returning extra change, the kind that puts you in an uncomfortable position with people who have power over your life. She worked in my home. My daughter could have made things very difficult for her. And she told me anyway because she believed I deserved to know. That kind of moral clarity, the willingness to do what's right even when there's real risk attached to it, is something most of us say we have, but very few of us actually demonstrate when it counts. And then there's what I had to do with what she told me. I want to be honest about this part. It would have been very easy to fall apart, to spend weeks grieving privately and not act until it was too late. Instead, I called Wendell the next morning. I went through the documents. I asked the hard questions. I made decisions while I was still in shock from what I'd learned because I understood, clearly, in a way I hadn't before. That clarity doesn't wait for you to feel ready. That's the part I'm most grateful for, looking back. Not that I was angry enough to act, but that I was clear-headed enough to act well, to think through what I actually wanted to protect and why, instead of just reacting, to name my son as executor, not out of spite, but because it was the right structural decision, to add Marta to my will, not as a gesture, but as a genuine recognition of what she'd given me over 19 years. Good judgment under pressure. That's not something you're born with. It's something you build by paying attention to your own life and being honest about what you see. And Sylvie, my daughter, the part of this story I still don't know exactly how to hold. I think about the person she was becoming in that relationship and the person she came back to being after it ended. I think about what it takes to look at yourself clearly after you've done something that betrayed your own values. Not just someone else's trust, but your own sense of who you are. That's a hard thing. A lot of people don't do it. They find reasons and explanations, and they build a story around those reasons until the story is more comfortable than the truth. She didn't do that. She sat at my kitchen table and she said she didn't know when she'd become someone capable of this. That sentence took courage. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that just stays in the room with what's true instead of trying to make it smaller. I'm not sure where we go from here. I'm not sure you ever fully go back, but I think you can go forward if both people are willing to be honest about what happened and what it cost and willing to keep showing up anyway. That's what I'm trying to do. The cottage is still ours. Marta knows she's in the will. My son cried on the phone and then pulled himself together and said he'd take the responsibility seriously. And on a Tuesday morning in October, Marta and I had tea in the kitchen and didn't need to say much else. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. The kettle was still warm on the stove when my phone rang. I remember that detail because I'd just poured myself a second cup of red rose, the way my mother used to drink it, and I was looking out the kitchen window at the snow piling up on the bird feeder. Late November in Thunder Bay does that to you. Slows everything down, makes you grateful for small things like a warm kitchen and a cup of tea before the world breaks open. I'm 63 years old. I taught grade 4 at St. Septity, Margaret's, for 31 years before I retired, and I thought I'd seen the worst of what people can do to each other. I was wrong. The phone kept ringing and I almost didn't answer it because the call display said unknown, but something in me, some old teacher's instinct that never quite leaves you, made me pick up. Mom? My daughter's voice. But not really. It was scraped raw, like she'd been crying for hours and had nothing left. Mom, please. Where are you? What's happening? I'm cold. I'm so cold. I was already pulling on my parka, my keys in my hand, my purse over my shoulder. "Tell me where, sweetheart. Stay with me." She tried to describe it. Some logging road north of the city, past the Kakabeka turnoff, somewhere off the old Trans-Canada. She'd been walking she didn't know how long. Hours, maybe? Her phone had 1 bar of service. She kept apologizing, which is what she's always done, my girl, my Holland, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. "Don't hang up," I told her. "I'm coming. Don't you dare hang up." I drove like a woman possessed. The snow was coming down sideways and the highway was half ice, and I didn't care. I had her on speaker, and every time she went quiet for too long, I'd shout her name until she answered. She told me bits and pieces. She'd been at her mother-in-law's place in the suburbs for what was supposed to be a family dinner. She'd argued with my son-in-law's mother. She didn't say about what. She said she'd been pushed down the back stairs. She said when she'd come to, she was in the back of a vehicle, and someone had driven her out past the city limits and left her there. She was 28 years old, 26 weeks pregnant. I found her at the edge of a service road I would never have spotted in summer, let alone in a whiteout. She dragged herself to a hydro pole and was leaning against it, her coat soaked through, her lips the color of bruised plums. There was blood on her face. Her left arm was bent in a way arms aren't meant to bend. And her belly, that beautiful round belly we'd been planning a nursery around just last weekend, was swollen tight as a drum. I got her into the truck. I put my own coat over her. I cranked the heat until the cab was a sauna, and I aimed for the regional hospital. And I prayed. Not pretty prayers. The kind of prayers you don't say in church. She talked when she could. "Mom," she said, "his mother told me I deserved this. She said I deserve it for what my family is. She said our blood doesn't belong in their bloodline." I had to grip the wheel hard to keep my hands from shaking right off it. "Sweetheart, what does that mean?" She closed her eyes. Tears slid out anyway. "She knows about Grandpa. She knows about the reserve. She said her grandchildren weren't going to come from a Métis girl whose family used to dig potatoes. I should explain. My father was Métis, born on the road allowance outside St. Laurent, Manitoba. He came east in the 50s looking for work, and he found my mother, a Finnish girl from Port Arthur, and they raised 4 kids in a frame house on Algoma Street with a vegetable garden out back and a fishing boat we kept at the marina. My father never hid where he came from, and he never bragged about it either. He just was who he was. He taught us that the people who try to make you small are the ones who feel smallest themselves. He also taught us, my brother Roland and I, certain other things. Things you don't learn in school. Things he'd learned from his own father, who'd learned them from his. My daughter's mother-in-law, a woman named Hester Wexford Pruitt, who'd grown up on a horse property in Caledon and married into more money than sense, had decided my Holland's blood wasn't good enough. I drove the rest of the way without speaking, because if I'd opened my mouth, I would have screamed. The emergency room at the regional was quiet for a Wednesday night. They had her on a gurney inside 30 seconds of seeing her. A young doctor with a tired face and kind eyes asked me what had happened, and I told him exactly what Holland had told me. I watched his expression change. He pulled the curtain. He spoke to a nurse in a low voice. The nurse made phone calls. I sat in the waiting room with a styrofoam cup of bad coffee, and I texted my brother Roland. "Holland is in the hospital. Hester did this. Drive up." 3 minutes later, he wrote back. "On my way." 2 hours. Roland is 67. He retired from the Ontario Provincial Police 4 years ago after 36 years on the job, the last 15 as a sergeant. He's a quiet man. He still wears a mustache from 1987, and he still drinks Tim Hortons coffee with 2 cream and 2 sugar. And he doesn't say much, but when he says something, you listen. While I waited, I thought about what my father told us when we were small. Not the stories he told to make us laugh, the other ones. The ones he told my brother and me when we were old enough. He said, family is the only thing that's truly yours. He said, when somebody comes for your family, you don't get loud and you don't get sloppy. You get patient. You learn everything about them. You find the rot because there is always rot, and you let the world see it. That's how you do it, he said. You don't break the law. You let the law break them. The doctor came out at 1 in the morning. He sat down beside me, which is never a good sign. Mrs. Hjelmstad, your daughter's stable. We've set the arm. There's bruising consistent with the significant fall, and we're concerned about her placenta. We've admitted her for monitoring. The baby's heartbeat is strong right now, but the next 48 hours are critical. And she'll keep the baby? We're going to do everything we can. I asked him if anyone had called the police. He said yes, that they were obligated to in cases like this. I nodded. I thanked him. I went into Holland's room and I sat beside her in a plastic chair and I held her good hand. And I watched her sleep with the fetal monitor making its little electronic heartbeat sounds, steady and stubborn. And I made a list inside my head. My son-in-law was named Philip. Philip Wexford Pruitt. He worked for his father's investment firm in Toronto. He'd met Holland at university in Kingston 6 years ago. He was, by every visible measure, a good husband. He'd cried at their wedding. He painted the nursery a soft Saskatchewan sky blue. The week before, he'd called me to ask whether his great-grandmother's bassinet would be safe to use given how old it was. He was kind. He was attentive. He adored my daughter. But he had not called me. Not that night. Not when his pregnant wife had failed to come home. That bothered me. Around 6 in the morning, Roland walked in. He was carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag of donuts because that's just who he is. He hugged me without saying anything, which was exactly what I needed. He looked at Holland for a long time. Then he sat down in the other plastic chair and said, "Tell me everything." I did. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Where's Philip?" "I don't know. Have you called him?" "No, don't." I looked at him. "No, don't." I looked at him. "Not yet," he said. "Let's see who calls who." That morning, the police came. 2 officers from the Thunder Bay Police took Holland's statement when she was strong enough to give it. She told them about the dinner, about Hester's drinking, about the argument over Christmas plans which had escalated into Hester calling her things I won't repeat here, about being pushed, about waking up in the dark in the back of an SUV, about being told to get out, about the door slamming and the tail lights disappearing. The officer asked, "And your husband, ma'am? Where was your husband during this?" Holland said. "He went out to pick up wine for dinner. He wasn't there when it happened." "Have you spoken to him since?" "No," Holland said quietly. "He hasn't called." Roland and I exchanged a look. By that evening, Philip still hadn't called. 20 hours had passed since my daughter left their house. He hadn't called her phone. He hadn't called the hospitals. He hadn't called me, his mother-in-law, his wife's emergency contact. Nothing. Roland left around 8 that night. He didn't say where he was going. I didn't ask. The next morning, my son-in-law called. He sounded panicked. He said he'd been trying to find Holland for hours. He said his mother had told him Holland had stormed out and gone to a friend's house. He said he hadn't wanted to bother me in case Holland needed space. He said he loved her. He said he was driving up. I let him talk. I said, "Philip, when did your mother tell you Holland left?" "Tuesday night, after dinner." "You're saying you've believed for almost 2 days that your wife was at a friend's house and you didn't try to confirm it?" A silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything. "Don't come up," I said. "Not yet." He started to argue. I hung up. Roland came back to the hospital that afternoon. He sat down. He took out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He'd been a cop for 36 years, and he still kept everything in those black moleskines my mother used to give him for Christmas. He said, "Hester Wexford Pruitt, maiden name Lothrop, born 1958, Oakville, Ontario. Father owned a chain of furniture stores in southern Ontario, married Charles Pruitt in 1981. Charles inherited the family investment firm in 1992. They have 2 children, Philip, your son-in-law, and an older daughter named Marguerite." "Marguerite," I said. "I've never heard of a Marguerite. That's because Marguerite died in 2003. She was 24. I stared at him. "What happened?" That's what I want to know, Roland said. He didn't tell me how he'd found this out. He didn't have to. He still has friends. He still knows people. He still has a way of looking up at you over the rim of his coffee cup that makes you tell him things you didn't mean to tell him. Marguerite Wexford Pruitt had been engaged at the time of her death to a man named Daniel Qureshi, a pediatric resident at Sick Kids in Toronto. The engagement had been controversial within the family. The death had been ruled an accident, a fall down the stairs at the family's country house outside Collingwood. There had been no inquest. Roland looked at me. Sound familiar? I felt my throat close up. There's more, he said. I've been looking at Hester's charity work. She's on the board of 3 foundations. One of them is something called the Pruitt Family Heritage Fund. It's been operating for 15 years, donates to historical preservation, mostly. It owns a building in Yorkville. It has assets of around $4 million. And I had a friend pull the public filings. 3/4 of the donations the fund receives go right back out to a numbered company in the Cayman Islands. I'd bet you my truck the numbered company is Hester. I sat very still. She's been laundering money through her charity for 15 years, Roland said. And nobody's ever looked because she's old money and she gives nice speeches at the Royal Ontario Museum. Why are you telling me this? Because Philip is about to inherit the firm, Roland said. His father's been sick for 2 years. Pancreatic cancer. He's got months. And once Philip inherits, Hester's access to the books changes. Everything she's hidden becomes Philip's problem, or his asset, depending on what Philip is. What do you mean? Roland looked at me with the eyes of a man who'd seen a lot of things he wished he hadn't. I mean, we don't know yet what Philip is. We know he didn't call. We know his sister died on a staircase. We know his mother just tried to kill his pregnant wife. The question is whether Philip knows. And the question after that is whether Philip cares. That night, Holland's contractions started. 26 weeks is too soon. The doctors moved her to a different floor. They gave her medication to slow things down. They told me they had a NICU bed ready, just in case. I sat outside her room and I cried for the first time. I cried for my daughter and for the baby boy she was supposed to bring home in March. I cried for myself because I was 63 years old and tired, and I'd already buried a husband and a father, and I wasn't sure I had it in me to bury anyone else. And then I stopped crying, because crying wasn't going to do a single useful thing for anyone, and my father would have been ashamed of me for sitting in a hallway with wet cheeks while a woman on a horse property in Caledon planned her next move. I called Roland. I said, "What do we need to do?" He said, "I'm already doing it." A man arrived at the hospital the next morning. He was about 40, in a Canadian Tire jacket with the lining showing through. He had a kind, slightly weathered face and a quiet way of moving, and he introduced himself as Quincy. He said Roland had sent him. He said he used to do investigations for an insurance firm, and now he did private work, and he was here to help. I was suspicious at first. Then he sat with Holland for an hour and listened to her tell her story, taking notes, asking gentle questions, and by the end, I trusted him the way you trust a man who's clearly seen worse and hasn't let it harden him. Quincy was the one who found the tracking device. He'd walked out to my truck in the parking lot and run his hands under the wheel wells like it was a routine thing, and there it was, magnetic, the size of a deck of cards, stuck up against the frame. "They've been following you," he said. "Since when?" "I guess since the night Holland called." I asked him what to do with it. "Leave it on for now," he said. "I have an idea." He took the tracker off my truck and attached it to a long-haul rig that pulled out of the truck stop on Highway 11 the next morning, headed for Winnipeg. Whoever was watching us would think we panicked and run for the prairies. It would buy us time, and we needed time. Holland's contractions stopped. The baby held on. I started spending nights at the hospital and days at my house, where Quincy set up in my dining room with 3 laptops and a bunch of cables and a printer that ran almost continuously. Roland came and went. He'd disappear for a day and reappear with manila folders. What we put together over the next 2 weeks was this. Hester Wexford Prude had been embezzling from her own family's charity for over a decade. The numbered company in the Cayman Islands was hers. She'd been using charitable donations, including donations from elderly women in her social circle who'd been told their money was going to fund museum acquisitions and historical preservation, to fund a lifestyle she could no longer afford. Charles's investment firm had taken big losses in 2008 and never fully recovered, and Hester had decided the family's reputation was worth more than the law. Her daughter Marguerite had figured this out in 2003. She'd been planning to tell her fiancé Daniel, who had been planning to tell his uncle, who happened to be a senior officer with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. The week before she was going to tell anyone, Marguerite fell down the stairs of the country house. The only people in the house at the time were Hester and Marguerite. Charles and Philip were both in Toronto. There had been a coroner's inquest eventually after Danielle had pushed for one. Nothing had come of it. A wealthy woman in Caledon had said her daughter slept, and that was the end of it. Philip had been 21 when his sister died. Old enough to wonder, young enough to be afraid of his mother. I didn't know yet whether Philip was a good man trapped by a mother he was afraid of, or whether he was something else. But I was going to find out. Quincy had also pulled phone records. Somehow, I didn't ask, and he'd matched the timing of Holland's drive into the woods with the vehicle that had pinged a tower north of Thunder Bay that night. The vehicle was registered to Hester. She'd flown from Toronto to Thunder Bay 2 days before the dinner, which meant the dinner had not been spontaneous. She'd planned it. She planned all of it. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a grandmother. That was the moment I felt like my father's daughter. I called Philip. I told him to come to Thunder Bay. I told him to come alone. I told him not to tell his mother. He came. I sat him down at my kitchen table and I poured him coffee. Roland sat at the end of the table. Quincy stood by the door. We laid out what we knew. The charity, the Cayman Company, the vehicle pings, Marguerite. Philip's face went white when we got to Marguerite. He had not known, or maybe he had suspected for 23 years and never let himself see it. There's a kind of knowing that isn't really knowing. The kind people use to keep their lives from coming apart, and I watched it come apart in him in real time. He put his head in his hands and he cried. "What do you want from me?" he said when he could speak. Roland said, "We want you to do the right thing, by your wife, by your sister, and by every old woman in Toronto who thought her donations were going to museums." Philip nodded. He went back to Toronto. He went to his father's lawyer, not his mother's. He spoke to the RCMP. He gave them everything Quincy had compiled, which was a great deal, plus some things Philip himself knew that Quincy hadn't figured out yet, which was even more. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning in mid-December. Hester was leaving a hair appointment in Yorkville. 2 officers approached her on the sidewalk. The charges, eventually, were extensive. Fraud over $5,000, money laundering, aggravated assault, attempted murder of an unborn child, a charge our system handles in particular ways but takes seriously when it has to. The Marguerite case was reopened. I don't know if anything will come of that one. Some things stay buried. But the rest of it, the financial crimes, the assault on my daughter, those were going to stick. The Crown moved fast. Hester's bail was denied because she was a flight risk. Her lawyers tried everything. None of it worked. The Cayman accounts had been frozen with help from Philip's cooperation. The forensic accountants had what they needed. The case was airtight. Holland delivered a baby boy on the 2nd of February. She was 34 weeks along, and he was small. 3 pounds, 11 ounces, but he was strong. They named him Eamon, after my father. He spent 4 weeks in the NICU. I sat with him most days, putting one finger gently against his impossibly small palm and watching him breathe. Philip was there too, every day. He'd left the firm. He couldn't run it now. He'd taken a job as a financial analyst with a forestry company in Salt Stick. Marie and he and Holland had bought a small place there, closer to me, far from Caledon, far from his mother, who was awaiting trial in a women's correctional facility outside Milton, and who would, the lawyers thought, be there for a very long time. Charles Pruitt died in March, before the trial. He never knew the full extent of what his wife had done. I'm not sure anyone did in the end, except Hester herself. Quincy came to Eamon's homecoming. So did Roland. So did half of Holland's friends from town, and a good number of people I'd taught at St. Margaret's, whose own children were now grown. We had ham sandwiches and butter tarts and a pot of coffee that never stopped, and somebody brought a tourtière, and somebody else brought a Saskatoon pie, and Holland sat on the couch in my living room with her son in her arms, and she smiled for the first time in 3 months. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the kitchen with Roland and we did the dishes together, the way we had when we were kids in our mother's kitchen on Algoma Street. He said, "Dad would have been proud of you." I said, "Dad would have been proud of both of us." He said, "That's what I meant." I dried the last plate. I looked out the window at the dark and at the snow, which had started falling again, and I thought about my daughter sleeping upstairs with her son, and I thought about Hester Wexford Pruitt sitting in a cell in southern Ontario, thinking about all the ways her life was supposed to go. My father used to say that the blood of a Métis woman is the blood of survivors. He said it without bragging and without bitterness, just as a fact. He said our people had been written off and overlooked and lied about for 200 years, and we were still here, and nothing about that was an accident. I thought about that as I turned out the light. I thought about Eamon upstairs, my grandson, with my father's name and my mother's eyes and Holland's mouth, and a tiny piece of all of us inside him. The blood of survivors. The blood that comes through. And I went up the stairs to bed. Sitting on my back porch the spring after Eamon came home, watching the ice break up on the lake, I found myself thinking about how a thing like this happens. Not the surface of it. The roots underneath. Hester didn't wake up one morning a cruel woman. She became one, slowly, over decades, every time she chose her vanity over the truth, and nobody stopped her. Her parents protected her. Her husband looked the other way. Her own daughter, Marguerite, paid the highest price for trying to stand in her path. And by the time my Holland walked into that dining room in Caledon, Hester had been getting away with cruelty for so long she genuinely believed it was her right. That's how it works, I think. Every choice we make sets a small stone in the wall of who we are becoming. You stack enough meme stones, and one day you wake up and you've built yourself into a person who can leave a pregnant woman by the side of a logging road and sleep that night. None of that happens by accident. None of it. What I want my grandchildren to understand, when they're old enough to hear it, is that the same law works the other way around. Every kind choice, every honest word, every time you do the harder right thing, instead of the easier wrong one, you are also building. You are stacking stones. And when the storm comes, and it always comes, the wall you've built is what holds. I think about my father a lot now. He didn't have much formal schooling. He worked with his hands his whole life, but he taught Roland and me 3 things that have carried me through everything. Be decent, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. Be smart, which to him meant patient, which meant waiting and listening and learning before you act. And be tough, which didn't mean loud or hard. It meant you don't quit, you don't fold, you stand back up. When Holland was lying in that hospital bed and we didn't know if she was going to keep her baby, I needed all 3 of those. I needed to be decent, so I didn't do something stupid I'd regret. I needed to be smart, so I let Roland and Quincy do the patient work that actually brought Hester down. And I needed to be tough enough to sit beside my daughter for 60 days without falling apart in front of her, because she needed her mother steady more than she needed her mother grieving. I'd be lying if I said I never wanted to do something else. There were nights I lay awake and imagined drives I could have taken, things I could have done with my own 2 hands. I understand the impulse. I just know my father was right. The law breaking them is sweeter, and it lasts longer, and it doesn't put you in a cell beside the woman who tried to ruin you. Eamon is 14 months old now. He's pulling himself up on the coffee table and laughing at the cat. He'll never know what his grandmother did or didn't do, those weeks he was fighting to stay alive. He'll just know he's loved. That's enough. That's the whole thing, really. That's the only revenge that ever truly wins.